one of the things that I found is the reflection of these definitions of business storytelling, which is uh, very dependent on the things that you can absolutely predict, and also has a tendency to go with the hero story, with the you encounter an obstacle and
Mm-hmm.
you kill the dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a feminine narrative, the dragon has something to teach you.
Welcome to the Storycraft podcast for storytellers. I'm your host, Meg Adams, and I'm here to help you explore how stories shape our connections. Wondering how stories help you network and advance? Looking to bridge online and face-to-face worlds, foster understanding, and ignite innovation? Look no further. Whether you're a leader, communicator, educator, or just love a good story, join us for actionable insights and real talk with professional storytellers, all aimed at helping you build stronger, better connections.
In this conversation, I spoke with Annette Simmons. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Annette so you can understand the context of our conversation, because we hopped right into it in this conversation, and it was a great one. Partially because Annette is an author, a storyteller. She has been for decades. Her most popular book is called The Story Factor: Inspiration, Influence, and Persuasion Through the Art of Storytelling. Came out in the year 2000. CEO Reed named it twice as one of the 100 best business books of all time, and it's now available in a third edition. But all 5 of her business books define and promote power with strategies and principles, even though, and in some cases specifically because, they undermine autocratic power over strategies. While she didn't mention gender in the early days, Annette sees a correlation between reinforcing feminine narratives and finding sustainable solutions to long-term global problems, something I was very excited to talk to her about and learn from her in our conversation. Her most recent book delves into this topic even more. It's called Drinking from a Different Well: How Women's Stories Change What Power Means in Action. And that book challenges traditional assumptions about what power is, what it is for, and who should have it. It was a wonderful conversation. I know you're going to love it. So here we go.
Yeah.
We're recording. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that, so like leading into my first question, which I feel like you're going to know, is what role do you think storytelling has to play right now in our current culture of disconnect?
Well, storytelling is already playing a role in creating disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started studying storytelling, I studied with traditional storytellers, and it was the old school method of community building and and collective moral uh, reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so that was 1994. Um, what's happened in the last 20 years is storytelling has been exploited as a tool. And so people who want to manipulate and create polarization tell stories that turn paradox into battles.
Mm-hmm.
So the paradoxes that we live with that really can never be resolved. They're simply, a back and forth. It's not one side wins. So for instance, structure versus freedom
Mm-hmm.
is a paradox. You have too much structure, and you don't have creativity. But then you have too little structure and you've got chaos, which is where we are right now with the deregulation that's happened over the last 30 years. So what's happened is that they're telling stories where one side wins. The traditional stories that I learned from actually incorporate paradox.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this old story about it comes from Africa, about 2 brothers who lived on either side of a road. And one time a stranger came through, and later at dinner they were talking about it, and one brother said, well, he was wearing a red hat, and the other brother said, no, he was wearing a black hat. And they got into such an argument over it that they stopped speaking. Well, the guy had a half red and half black hat, and so they were both right. And so the stories that I would like to see more of is the stories that communicate that paradox is not something to be resolved like a conflict. It's a contrast.
Hmm.
And so all the answers are in the middle. And the polarization, now they torpedo people in the middle. And story has been abused, particularly because the feedback mechanism is clicks these days and likes and that sort of stuff. And so emotions have a certain speed. Love is a slow, grounded tolerance and patience. Disdain and anger is fast. And so we have been using this feedback loop that reinforces stories of disdain and anger, while we are not taking the time, because it does take time, it takes patience, it takes tolerance to ruminate on just whether this is a conflict or a contrast. And so my goal is so there are trends in leadership studies that I'm 62, so I've watched it come and go. And you will end up with something that's in fashion. For instance, servant leadership was in fashion, systems thinking was in fashion. All of these things were pure gold when they came out because it was about the substance. And then as people start to monetize it, like they've done with storytelling, it's about the image instead of the substance. And so my hope is we can get more people interested in the substance of storytelling and not the image.
Love what you're hearing on this podcast? Consider booking me to speak at your next event. Dive further into the transformative power of storytelling with my keynote. Tell better stories, speak up, stand out, and build community. In a world that often amplifies our differences, my talk invites you to embrace genuine connections. Break free from the echo chambers and discover the art of storytelling. Learn how to share your own narrative, listen actively, and foster communities that flourish on shared experiences. Check out the show notes to learn more about how to book a talk for your next event.
What do you think? You said you've watched this since 1994. Obviously we've seen the internet come of age. And I mean, I've seen that in my career as well. What role do you think, especially social media, has to play in terms of really, does it drive people away from that substance that you're talking about towards image? Like you mentioned clicks and likes.
I think social media, when there's real humans behind the story, can be a very good thing. But when social media is exploited with the intent to distribute disinformation, and there are big factories of people who do nothing but that, then they've sabotaged our ability to create community. And it's like a virus. So it's the manufacturing. I think there's some other aspects of social media with real human beings that can also be problematic. But the big danger, I think, is this manufactured disinformation.
And as you mentioned, that creates those emotional feelings of anger and disdain that travel.
And it gets addictive.
Yes, absolutely.
Disdain is an emotion that so I wrote the book Territorial Games. And the thing is, you can be nasty to someone who you decide is your enemy. So that's the story, that these people are my enemy. And so then the behavior follows.
Yep.
So in the last 20 years, the assumption of negative intent, and I can't remember the study that this comes from, between Republicans and Democrats, has increased at least 2 times as much as it was 20 years ago. That's a big increase. The assumption of negative intent is behind a lot of this bad behavior. So with Territorial Games, what I would do is I would talk about the 10 games people play, and I would de-escalate, because we all do it. We all have egos. And so one of the things, when I was collecting the stories, I never spoke to one person who said, I started it. They were all like, they started it. And so as long as you can externalize the demon, then you get to be self-righteous, and your behavior starts to deteriorate.
Oh, absolutely. I can think of this in like small instances, and like you were saying, they can grow very quickly into bigger instances of poor behavior. So how does storytelling help us hold space for these differing perspectives? How do we get out of that narrative of they're the enemy, I'm the hero?
One of
I
the
know you've studied this for a long time, so.
Well, most of what I have that's valuable is from experience.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of things you can study in books, and it's true, it's accurate, but it's not helpful.
Yeah.
Um, it's one of my pet peeves is storytelling always has a beginning, middle, and end. It's like, what
Mhm.
does it? What a useless piece of information, at least as far as I'm concerned. Um, so ask the question again. I got
Yeah, no,
distracted.
no, no. Yeah, no. I just how do we hold space
Oh,
for
right. Okay,
being in
that's
the middle ground for the
okay.
two different
I
perspectives?
have two tricks. I have two tricks that I use that work
Okay.
when I'm facilitating. One of the things is people want to hire me to tell the company story.
Mhm.
We want to get our narrative straight. I refuse to work with anybody if we don't start with the who I am, why I'm here story.
Mhm.
So it's to a certain extent is you have to keep your boundaries. I mean, if you're going to go out there and teach storytelling, in my opinion, then you have a obligation to look at the moral aspects of storytelling. And here's what happens is when I get people to tell their who I am, why I'm here story, um, they tune in to the best of them.
Mm.
And so getting people to tune in to the best, their, better angels,
Yeah.
is one of the things. And so that works because instead of the company story, people actually have to show up. And when they show up, they care what they look like. And that impacts the way they behave. And so after I do the who I am, why I'm here story, the whole dynamic of the room changes.
Mm.
So that's one thing I do. The other thing is I'm mostly retired. I only take the jobs that I care about.
Yeah.
And which is luxury,
I was just gonna
freedom.
say that sounds so lovely.
Oh my God, it's amazing. It's amazing. So I was contacted by a group in Europe, facilitators. And so the term psychological safety is
Mm.
up again,
Mhm.
again. And what's interesting is that it's another one of those golden to lead things.
Mm.
I think it was Google that had the Aristotle project, and they spent millions probably on
Right.
investigating what are the core uh, aspects of a high performing team. What's the one thing you can't do without? And so they thought that it would be diversity. They thought it would be IQ. They thought it was psychological safety.
Mm.
And yet, while they discovered it was psychological safety, they did not do a very good job operationalizing it.
Sure.
And so they've contacted me, and my methods of creating psychological safety include these stories like the red hat, black hat,
Mhm.
and definitely paradox. And so I've been working on the core paradoxes that really cause polarization and telling stories specifically about that.
When you're in I love this idea of talking about psychological safety because I think that I totally agree with you. But I wonder, I'm thinking of all the spaces that I've been in that have been larger organizations with maybe like hundreds of employees. And I don't think I've ever once, to be completely honest in it, felt psychologically safe enough
No, no.
to tell the stories that probably needed to be told. So, I mean, is that, do you think that's possible for an organization to operationalize that? Like,
Uh,
or,
Well, It's possible, definitely. Will they do it? I don't know. Because, okay, so here's another one of my paradigms that I work on, the competitive narrative versus a collaborative narrative.
Yes.
And so a competitive narrative, it is unsafe to share valuable information without making a transaction that you get something in return.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
In a collaborative narrative, we all pool all of our information. So if an organization is highly dependent on competitive narrative with the theory that it's going to improve performance, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
It turns genius into gruel.
Yep.
And I'm borrowing that phrase from, I think, Thomas Friedman. Anyway, it's a great phrase. And so one of the things, so my last book was about women's stories.
Mm-hmm.
Drinking from a different well, how women's stories change what power means in action. And so here I discovered that while gender is a continuum, there are considered masculine traits and feminine traits. So we'll just, go from there. But
Mm-hmm.
the feminine would be, nurturing. It's the collaborative narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I found, frankly, I've been looking at this gender thing ever since I wrote Territorial Games. I just didn't name gender. It was too
Yeah, that's so
unsafe.
interesting.
It
Yeah.
was too unsafe. But we ruin the fun and games of competitive players because some of the things that we do break the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so the rules of competition are to, you just have to look at the art of war because that's been operationalized into, business thinking and deception, surprise, distraction. All of these are considered fair
Mm-hmm.
in a competitive environment. And in order to create a collaborative environment, you get the competitive environment wants to dominate and control.
Mm-hmm.
And the collaborative environment requires psychological trust, because everybody is allowed to be autonomous and contribute without being monitored. One of the problems that I think with psychological safety is the extreme monitoring of employees.
Mm.
And when you monitor an employee to the point where you know when they're on the computer and when they're not, you are expressing distrust. You tell a story to that employee, and the story that you tell is that we don't trust you. And I have one reaction when someone says, I don't trust you. And that's like, well, I don't trust you either.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And so I think that it's absolutely possible. I hear that Apple, I just read an article the other day, has instigated a lowering of the monitoring. And particularly the dilemma we have with remote work. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
an artifact of whether you're trusted or not. That's a good tell. And so they backed off, trying to get people back in the office. So there are all sorts of things that people could do to improve their corporate environment.
I love how you're connecting to like behaviors to storytelling. Sometimes I don't think I think people associate storytelling. I mean, I've heard everything, as I'm sure you have, Annette, from, oh, that's what I do when I put my kids to bed, to like, well, this is what marketers do in advertisements. But to associate storytelling and thinking through how your behavior tells an implicit story and how people will react to that is interesting.
Yeah, I talked to a lawyer who said that when he goes into a courtroom, he doesn't know who's in the jury and who's not before he gets there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there are actually two entrances at the courthouse. There's the fast one for the lawyers, and then there's one for all the regular people. He stands in the regular people line, because it tells a story about how he sees himself.
Mm-hmm.
And you never know who's watching. I always say, always be sure that you let the other person have the parking place when there's two of you, because you never know when you walk in who's who's going to be interviewing you.
Well, that's such a good, I also really, I love that story and the stories you've told, but I also love the idea of thinking through, and I know you have a background in psychology too, but a lot of the like stories we tell ourselves about who we want to be and how we want to show up. And then sometimes that there's a disconnect between that and how we behave, or that it can be aligned with how we want to behave. And I think that's a great, little example of how I want to behave today is as a generous person. So I'm going to give this person the parking spot.
And it starts to make a big difference. One of the things that I learned as a practitioner is that so I used to facilitate dialogue, where people are at an impasse, they're ready to split the law firm, or I worked with military intelligence after they found evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and
Wow.
gave them the opportunity to have a dialogue about how do we find evidence of something that didn't exist. It was remarkable. But
I can't imagine. Yeah.
yeah, it's so what I learned is that I have to promise them that it's temporary, that we're going to be open and affirming, we're going to be tolerant and patient just for one day, just
Hmm.
for one day. And so I get a lot more buy-in. Of course, a lot of people still don't trust it, and then the leader's going to have to role play safety
Mhm.
in some way. Um, Not role play, but demonstrate, sorry. And what happens is that they have a profound emotional experience,
Hmm.
and they do it again. Sometimes they have a profound emotional experience and they never do it again.
Yeah.
Um, you can't control for that, because you're a facilitator, you go in, you don't know what the environment is. I had two sociopaths over 30 years, so that wasn't too bad.
Yeah.
But because most people that you think are sociopath actually are just screwed up.
Hmm.
And one of the aspects of my understanding came from running self-awareness workshops for 3 years, where I heard people, and when I say self-awareness workshops, I'm talking about that intense, weekend sort of
Okay. Yeah.
come
Thank
to
you for that
Jesus meeting,
context.
right? It's residential. And I heard hundreds and hundreds of executives tell their stories.
Hmm.
And so, like, one of the executives that was just a jerk, and I'm sure he got sent to us to be fixed, and in maybe day two, told the story about when he was 7 years old and his brother drowned, and his father blamed him.
Oh,
And so you're like, oh wow, so it
yeah.
increases the tolerance. Everybody has a story.
Sure.
So
Yes.
for
Yeah.
me, helping people realize that everybody has a story
Hmm.
is one of the steps. And it's the temporary thing that gets them to do the sample, the taste test,
Yeah.
and then ideally they do it more. But I've found no success in saying this is the way you should be all the time.
That's interesting, Annette. I guess I've always I'm a very optimistic person, I've been told. So like hearing you with your wealth of experience, I mean, it's sort of, I appreciate you giving that example, but I want to go back a little bit. You were talking about feminine narratives, and you noted in your bio that you sent to us a correlation between reinforcing feminine narratives and finding sustainable solutions for
Mhm,
some of the global issues that we're facing. And
mhm.
I was so curious to hear more about that. And I sort of feel like we're dovetailing into that a little bit. How
Yeah,
can we
yeah.
use that narrative or that openness of collaboration to, I mean, deal with some of these? I even can think as you were talking, some of the most pressing issues in my life that I think about are how to how to engage in hyper competitive environments with with a feminine narrative, with a more of a collaborative mindset and approach. And I
Well,
don't know if it's possible.
let's look at Tay Tay. Taylor Swift.
I love
I
Taylor Swift.
I do too. I mean, there are courses on her now, okay?
Yes.
I mean, talk about a hyper competitive environment and a collaborative. I mean, uh, she, she she uses generosity as kind of
Mhm.
like her competitive advantage, if you will,
Yes.
which is clashing narratives. But I did too. When I first started writing, th- there were people who wrote books, business books, that really were just, cards, call me.
Hmm.
And they were doing it for publicity. They didn't give away all their secrets. I gave away all my secrets because I believed that, because I know how I want to live.
Mhm.
So I'm not worried about the hyper competitive world. Of course, it's more hyper competitive now. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. Of course, now AI has wiped my books, so
Oh,
that's an issue. But anyway, and we should talk about AI too. So, oh, remind me what I was talking about.
we were talking about feminine
Oh,
narratives.
right. Okay.
Yep.
So Tay Tay. So
Yes.
she gave $100,000 bonuses
Mhm.
to all of, her road crew. That's ridiculous in a competitive frame, but there's evidence, and we can't deny it, that she has created a whole new way of doing business in the music business.
Mhm.
So for instance, one of the things she did is she re-recorded all of her
Yeah. Her
music.
song. Mhm.
So in a way, boundaries, you know, uh, I am generous. I believe in second chances. As a matter of fact, I think that if you do a second chance right, you can get a positive response almost 50% of the time.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so, that's one of the things. A lot of people try something, it doesn't work, and then they toss it in the trash can. Behavioral interventions, like
Mhm.
storytelling, works about 50 to 70% of the time. And when you try to make it perfect, then you destroy it. So, so one of the aspects of feminine narratives includes these second chances. It includes multiple ratios. Fair has 7 different definitions. So if you want to increase trust in a room, one of the things that I do is I just talk about the different definitions of fair. Whoever needs it gets the most, whoever brought the bacon in gets the most, whoever works the hardest gets the most, whoever got there first gets the most. And it takes people off their ladders of inference.
Mhm.
And I think I coined this term, it re-ambiguates
Huh.
clarity.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that is feminine narratives do is we trade understanding, we trade clarity for understanding, because
I
not
love
everything's clear.
Right.
The second thing is that feminine narratives have a much bigger circle of moral concern.
Mhm.
So in a competitive environment, it's only your team you care about. So that inevitably is going to create lots of losers.
I love
Um,
that.
huh?
I mean, I really enjoyed I love the way that you are clarifying these distinctions, without
Well,
apology.
one of the reasons why I stopped taking gigs that I don't like is that I could feel them trying to change my methodologies.
Mm.
And the first thing I did was I started doing disclaimers. I would say, what I won't do
Mhm.
right up front so that I can move on quickly
Right.
away from a hyper competitive,
Right.
I'm not going to get eaten alive.
Right.
And so I think that's part of it. It's particularly when I think about my own feminine narratives. Yeah, boundaries are really, really important. And so the women, so when we promote collaborative narratives, we have to be equally tolerant and patient. And when someone is committed to being abusive, cut them off.
Yeah.
So I give second chances. Even the worst asshole, I'm going to give a second chance to.
Mhm.
But after a while, I don't have that kind of time.
I also very much appreciate that advice. I think it's well taken.
Well, yeah, it took me years to learn it. Anybody I can help that's still in the middle of it, I'm quite happy to.
I really appreciate that. We hear a lot of talk about boundaries, but I think that that's absolutely important when you think about your work and when you are trying, to I think a lot of people are hitting this, and I think that that's true too. I've heard it said, the other way is like, don't enter an argument with someone who's not even willing to come, like if their intention heading into that conversation is to prove themselves right, like you're not going to get anywhere, and kind of recognizing that can be a way to,
Well, I have to say that I'm going to give him a second chance, and I have
yeah,
little
yeah.
tricks
Okay.
to help. And one might be to ask about their childhood.
Oh.
And to get them, because you're trying to get them in the a receptive state.
Mm-hmm.
And receptivity is something that I can actually offer.
Mm-hmm.
Role model. I have had conversations with rabid extremists. I would only say it's like 20 to 30%, maybe even less. But
Yeah.
I'm an optimist too.
Yeah.
And also it's a good learning exercise,
Yeah.
I'll try
Absolutely.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, the only successes I've had is to get them telling true stories about what's important to them. And if I can get them in that place, then we can find a place to connect.
Yeah.
Because the polarization is like either somebody's rabid about structure, or somebody's rabid about freedom. Currently, that's a pretty polarizing paradox right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, it's both. So I can, if they're all about freedom, I can meet them there.
Mm-hmm.
And then lead them to, well, what happens when you have too much freedom?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes,
Right.
but you can feel them tense up when they realize I'm trying to bring them to the middle, and that's fear and disdain, and that's from these misleading stories that people are putting out.
Okay, we had to pause the podcast to let you in on this opportunity. If you're ready to elevate your brand storytelling, don't miss our training, Tell Better Stories, led by me, a seasoned television journalist and PR professor, and Kyle, an on-air meteorologist and video storytelling expert. This workshop unveils our secrets to craft compelling, personal-driven narratives that resonate with your audience. Learn our distinct approach that puts people first and brands second, leveraging 6 storytelling elements for maximum impact. Walk away with actionable strategies, tactics, and a clear process to replicate success in any organization. Check out the show notes to learn more about this offer, or reach out to homeplacecreative@gmail.com.
Do you have any thoughts on, like, I've seen a lot of people, and it's just an observation that I've made in the past, especially, again, I think it's been heightened since the pandemic, about people attaching themselves to these larger like monomyths, so these larger stories, and they start to see their own identity in these
Mhm.
stories,
Mhm.
and it's sort of it almost moves them away from
Mhm.
their personal
Oh,
experience
it
and story.
does.
Right. That's something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Could you talk? It's an observation of mine that I've found in these conversations with people. And I do have a difficult time getting them even out of, but that's not your experience. I'm having a hard time, or it's just, I guess, interesting to me as an observation that I see that happen a lot in the conversations that I try to have with people, again, to get to a place, the middle, as you call it.
Right. Yeah. Did you have a question in there? Because
I guess it was more just like a comment of like, I guess the question would be, how do you, or if you, I don't know if you have any tips, if that's happening in a conversation with someone where you really are aiming to find the middle or find a collaborative solution to something, and
okay.
you see that happening.
So humans are craving attention right now. And we've automated so much that it's not the real thing.
Mhm.
To look someone in the eyes and to relax your body and just really be curious about what they have to say can sometimes change, where they're at. Just trying to think about the last time it happened. You know, psychological silence is something that I was taught back in the 90s by my mentor, Jim Farr.
Mhm.
And so we would do the 360-degree interviews. We would go, an executive, and we would interview 10 people who work with them, for them, all that sort of stuff.
Okay.
And we would transcribe the verbatims. So I don't believe in surveys because
Mhm.
that's oversimplifying. But when you can get true anecdotes,
Mhm.
and then we would put them in a collection, we would de-identify anybody who spoke about it. But it was an intense interview because you
Mhm.
don't want to talk trash about someone. And of course,
Right.
everybody you interview, they've got their own, things going on.
Sure.
And so Jim taught us psychological silence, which people don't realize how much their facial expressions
Hmm.
can trigger, you know. So if I'm talking to somebody and I'm like, or
Oh yeah. Right.
I get in trouble for that face all the time. My husband is like, "What?" So
That's
it's
funny.
amazing how much our facial expressions actually can change the nature of the conversation.
Oh, that's good advice. Yeah,
And
and body
so we
language.
learn that as an interview technique, the
Mhm.
psychological silence. Because if the person thinks you're judging them for what they're saying, they're going to get defensive.
Mhm.
Um, and if they think they're pleasing you, they may just start to cater to what they think you want.
Yeah. So you're not getting to the truth of whatever's happening there.
Yeah, yeah. Transactional analysis was a big a part of my theory set. And what it says is that you have three ego states. Of course, we have 1,000, but who cares? You can talk from the parent, which is this business, from the adult, which is let's just deal with what's going on, or from the child, which can be rebellious or playful. There's room for all those ego states. But when you have uh, a conversation where you're turning into either the parent or the child, and the other person, a lot of these extremist conversations are parent, judging. And one of the things that I do when I facilitate groups is I get them into the playful child.
Mhm.
I have people make art. I
Oh,
have storytelling is art.
yes. Yes.
And storytelling is play, in the most serious aspect of what play is for. uh Play is basically a chance to run scenarios without risking anything real.
Mm.
Um, and so these narratives allow people to sit in a different place, and have a different point of view. So yeah, I think that's enough about that.
No, but that's very helpful information because I think, a lot of what I'm hoping that will help listeners in whatever situation or context they're in is really finding that middle ground. And like we've talked about since the outset of the conversation, it seems like there's so many outside factors pushing us away from that
There
anymore.
are.
And so I really appreciate the advice that you've given in all respects towards that. Another thing, and I think you mentioned this earlier, you talked about how storytelling, how you've worked, with storytellers who follow the old school
Yeah.
traditions. Is that what you said,
Yeah.
Annette?
Old
Yeah.
school.
So, but there, as you said, the term storytelling has been, it depends on who you're talking to, right? If you're talking to somebody in entertainment, they think storytelling is this. If you talk to somebody in marketing, it's sort of a buzzword, if you will. I think it has been for the past 10 years
20
or so.
years.
Yeah, 20 years. So could you talk about how can you help people focus, or where should they go if they want to focus on more of those old school traditional impacts and uses of
So
stories?
that's why I wanted to talk about AI.
Mm-hmm.
Pardon me. Because AI uh, is very young. And all it was fed for is these templates, and storytelling is script. So
And
there
AI
are
stands for Annette. What is AI?
artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I didn't know if we were talking about, thank you for that
Right.
clarification.
No,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
So a friend of mine is a tech genius,
Mm-hmm.
and she likes my books, and she likes AI. I
Mm-hmm.
hate AI. And it hurt her feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So she's like, I'm going to set you up as a developer on OpenAI. And let's get some of your ideas into, a chat assistant or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Well, first of all, AI is basically a mansplaining system because it values certainty so highly
Mm.
that the templates. This is how you ended up with the monomyth. James uh, Campbell, with his
Mhm.
best of intentions, thought that if he could just find that one thing that is the same, that it would provide a great insight.
Mhm.
And so AI is looking for the answers. And business storytelling, a lot of it is designed to monetize your information. And so in order to monetize it, you have to provide guarantees. And now we're
Mhm.
back to I so I got contacted with this facilitation group, and I said, I have some things that work about 50 to 70% of the time if you're
Mhm.
interested. And that tells me who has a collaborative narrative and who doesn't. If you understand that nothing works 100% of the time, we can work together.
Mhm.
Um, and and so one of the things that I found is the reflection of these definitions of business storytelling, which is very dependent on the things that you can absolutely predict, and also has a tendency to go with the hero story, with the you encounter an obstacle, and
Mhm.
you kill the dragon.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, in a feminine narrative, the dragon has something to teach you. Dragons, are wise. And so one of the things that I've found is that the framework that has been applied to business storytelling is from a competitive narrative.
Mm.
And so it's the old school storytelling. And I have on my shelf, I have all of these ancient stories. If you want some interesting old style folk tales, go into Hungarian folk tales. They last forever.
So-
And so one of the things that I want to remind people is that the hero story in its original form started out with the hero leaving and coming across three different characters that needed something. So Jack leaves home, he has a loaf of bread and he meets someone who's starving. And while he needs that loaf of bread, he actually shares it. And then there's a bird that, is hurt, and you take care of the bird. And then at the end of the hero story, when everything's really dangerous, it's the guy you shared the bread with that turns out to be a wizard that saves your ass.
Yeah.
And so these old stories have moral lessons, but without storytelling, generosity doesn't get rewarded without these old stories. And so collaborative narratives require trust that in the future, without my ability to control your behavior at all, after things change, you'll still do the right thing.
Mhm.
That's trust. And that's an irrational, there's no ratio that's going to reinforce that.
Mhm.
And it's one of the reasons I use this 50 to 70% ratio, because the engineers it's just like, for them to even imagine that you're going to do something that's going to fail, 50% of the time, they just don't get that.
Yeah.
And so that's one of my problems with the way business storytelling
Mm.
has de-ambiguated moral lessons, and we need to re-ambiguate them.
Do you have any thoughts on how to re-ambiguate them, how to move toward I know you mentioned earlier, like, you didn't like the beginning, the advice of beginning, middle, and end. Is that part of it? I mean, what can we do to re-ambiguate narratives if someone listening maybe is owner of a business or a corporation or
Well, I'm just now working on that.
Yeah.
And right now, what I am looking at is educating people about paradox.
Yeah. That makes
So
sense.
telling those stories about paradox.
Mhm.
I have another friend, Thaler, who did a TED talk on paradox after we started talking about it. So it's got legs.
Mhm.
I really do believe that if we were better educated about paradox, that we'd be much more receptive to these stories. One of the things I invented along the way, I use graphics a lot,
Mhm.
and I have to have a flip chart. I've got to draw. I don't like PowerPoint because it doesn't appear before the eyes in the same way that me drawing. And also there's just a generosity of watching someone. It's kind of like improv, watching
Yeah.
someone trying to draw stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so I have this model where it's a box, and that represents a room. And
Mhm.
so everybody that comes in has their own belief about what the problem is.
Mm.
So the guy from accounting has, what we need is better, controls. You have the guy from marketing, and he comes in is what we need is less controls. And so you end up with these 5 different belief systems. Uh, and everybody is going to be polite in the beginning, because they know that he doesn't see it my way, and that sort of stuff, and they're not going to risk. Well, if it gets intense enough, if it's important enough conversation, they're going to clash. They're going to find the places where this belief system doesn't fit that belief system. So as I'm drawing this, I say that each one of us has to open up our belief system and
Mm.
take in, because we each have a part of the picture.
Mhm.
And by sharing our stories, then we end up 5 times as smart as we were when we walked in. And I prep them, and I say, now the reason why you won't do this is human beings have a low tolerance for the frustration necessary to understand somebody else's narrative,
Mhm.
and we have a bias for action.
Mm.
We'll come up with an action plan that nobody's going to adhere to, just to get out of the room.
Yeah.
And so when I draw their attention to the stuff they do that actually contributes to either collaborative or a competitive environment, then people reflect in their imaginations and they have a chance to imagine being different this time. Not all the time, just this time. So I've had some success with that.
I love the way that you frame that, and I also love the idea of drawing it out as opposed to, I think that's a beautiful way to sort of visualize the process, of storytelling and
I'm trying to
collaboration.
activate another part of their brain.
Yes.
And imagination is wanting right now.
Mhm.
So in many ways, storytelling is to take someone on an imagined journey so that they can experience a different point of view. So my definition of story is a significant emotional experience narrated so that both of you are reliving it. One of the things that I teach with storytelling, people are so concerned about being polished, that they don't activate their own imagination, which is, having TED Talks be scripted is one of my pet peeves, but it does help with time.
Mhm.
Um, so so I go to storytelling workshops with traditional tellers.
Mm.
It's the cheapest, best, you have to have a lot of tolerance because it's not a professional environment.
Mhm.
But I learned so much. And so I did one with Heather Forrest and Milbury Birch, two other names that you need to interview. And one of the exercises was to stand in front of the rest of the group and just imagine your story without using words. And it's amazing that you can actually see, but it also is just a wonderful exercise that grounds you in the fact that you need to be reliving this story in its visceral reality. See,
Mhm.
smell, taste, touch, hear. And when you do that, it creates a level of understanding in your listener that this whole polished scripted doesn't.
Mhm.
And so, but I can't even imagine asking a corporate environment, you know.
I tried. I mean, I saw a lot of, yeah, you're speaking my language, Annette, because I think that as human beings, we know, like we can sniff that out. Like we know when you're not, and that defeats the purpose of what you're trying to do.
Oh my God, I read a article that was talking about being authentic. And in today's world with our celebrity culture and everything like that, they said unhinged is the new authentic. It's like if you're not like out of control, then you must not be, real, which
Yeah,
explains a lot of characters out there.
yeah.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
does. Yeah, I have lots of I feel like I have lots to say about authenticity in general. But yeah, I think that, and you said this earlier though, and I love the example. I use Taylor Swift for this example when I talk about authenticity, that you are, and you said this, I think this goes back to like that there's no beginning, middle, and end to a story. Like you're constantly evolving or if changing perspectives or depending on environment and situation and audience, your authentic personality, your voice is going to be very different. And so I
Well,
like to take the
now wait
pressure
a
off.
minute. I'm going to push back on that.
Okay.
So one of my pet peeves
Uh-huh.
is analyzing the audience. That's what they teach you to do.
Yes,
Analyze
they
the
do.
audience.
I'm a rhetorician. That's like the first thing they teach you to do.
No, no,
Okay, Annette,
no.
tell me why. I
You
want to
need to
know.
love your audience.
Oh, yeah.
And so analyzing, just the term analyze,
Mm-hmm.
is you being objective, and it puts you in a position of either superiority or inferiority. If you're afraid of your audience
Oh, yeah.
or you think you're smarter than your audience,
Mm-hmm.
that's not where authenticity
Not
lives.
where you're gonna be. Right.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I always do is, and I'm not terribly Christian, but prayer is a ritual that has its place. And so before I go to work with a group, I pray to be of service to them.
Mm-hmm.
And and so there's three things I ran across a long time ago about how to be authentic.
Mm-hmm.
One is that you come from a place of equality, not superiority, not below, but equality. One is that you use descriptive language instead of judgmental language.
Mm-hmm.
So that's show don't tell, basically, in storytelling. And then the last one is that you use provisional language.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that they taught women is that you're supposed to be declarative, and you're supposed to, stand up for yourself, and I expect, this will happen, as opposed to this may happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I've learned is that that's not true. The whole idea of certainty actually shuts people down. But when you invite them to consider another point of view, perhaps, and you hold this loosely, then it's more inviting for them to come and explore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you need to fall in love with your audience. One of the things that I do before I speak is I want to talk to at least 3 or 4 people who are going to be in the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And I just ask them to tell me what their problems are.
Mm-hmm.
And what their delights are.
Hmm.
And I fall in love with them.
Yeah.
Or I don't take the job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just not a good fit.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really good advice. Yeah, that's great. I love that. I think it takes a lot of pressure off too when you think about it from
Absolutely.
someone who has to, if you're giving a presentation or you have to speak or whatever it is, to just love your audience and
Yeah.
meet them where they're at. And
Yeah,
that's
I get very, very nervous. I don't do big keynotes anymore. It's just
Mhm.
too stressful. I'll throw up before I
Oh,
go on
yeah.
stage. It's just too stressful. But I had to learn that in order to calm down enough to do a good job.
Yeah.
One of the best compliments I ever got was way back in the 90s, with my first book. And this guy came up to me, he goes, I love your presentation. You're just so unpolished. And I was like, well, thank you.
Like,
But
okay.
I mean, it was a compliment. It
Yeah.
really
Oh,
was.
yeah. Yeah. It was
And
real. Maybe in
I've
another
had
way
people
too.
tell me I need to be more polished, my agent.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm me. I'm happy.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, I feel like I could talk to you all day, Annette, but I do want to respect your time. We have a few wrap-up questions. One which you already answered, which is the definition of story, how you define storytelling. So I'm not going to ask you that one. But the other one is, I have 2 other ones. The first one is, what is your favorite story? Whether that can be, and we have a wide definition of story here, but what's your favorite one?
Well, of course that changes. But
Yes.
this morning, um, I went to see Lucinda Williams last night. She's a singer, rock and roll singer, songwriter. She's had a
Mhm.
stroke. She's 71 years old, but she did a retrospective. And I think that the singer-songwriters
Mhm.
that tell stories are totally my favorite. So last night she I'm from Louisiana and she's from Louisiana, and so she has this driving to Baton Rouge.
Mhm.
And it's the story that allows me to relive some of the most meaningful times. I John Prine
Oh,
is
I love
another good
yes.
storyteller,
Yeah.
and Johnny Cash.
Mhm.
And so I can name some of my favorite storytellers. And I think Taylor Swift does a good job
Yeah.
too.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And then the next question is, what is a piece of advice about storytelling that's just so good you have to let us know, or so bad you also have to let us know?
Okay, the hero story is so bad.
That's what I mean.
I
Like,
just I mean, it has its place, but it's been
sure.
morphed into something that's
Yeah.
abusive. And if and I go back to the idea that dragons have stories to tell,
I love that analogy too. Yeah.
and so and I guess the way I get people to find stories is that I have them go back to a significant emotional event
Hmm.
so that they're not using a template,
Right.
so that they're actually telling something true,
Mm-hmm.
technically true. That's another thing, is that if a story's
Oh,
not
yeah.
true, don't tell
Right.
it.
It's, yeah, perspectives are
Unless you're an
great.
author or an artist, you know. And so narrating what happened to you, or what you watched in a movie, or what you read in a book, or what a mentor told you,
Mm-hmm.
narrating that in order to recreate the emotion is going to create your best story.
Mm-hmm.
Don't worry too much about, I mean, the character development, all that stuff, that's important. But if you don't have a significant emotional experience to narrate, then you don't have a story.
Mm-hmm.
And so AI, creates stories.
Mm-hmm.
And to a certain extent, it has learned what heartstrings to tug.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that takes you further and further away from understanding what storytelling really is.
Do you think that's because it's omitting the human to human connection?
It's omitting the mess,
Mm-hmm.
the subjectivity. And so one of the things that I've preached for a long time is that you can have an objectively great decision, quality decision. It's you're 100% right. And if nobody likes it, it ain't going to happen.
Right.
And so the objective is half the job. The subjective is the other half of the job.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to do with, so many things. But uh, it definitely has to do with telling the story of how you came to this perfect solution. People need to struggle with the tensions in there along with you before they understand the compromises you had to make
Mm-hmm.
to take one course of action and not another.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Thank you, Annette. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
What a joy. I've had
I
a
know,
blast.
I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
We're so glad you've listened to this podcast episode. If you liked it, would you mind doing us a favor? Share this episode with someone who would be interested in the topic too. We're on a mission to help everyone become a better storyteller. And don't forget to subscribe to the show to get updated every time we release a new episode. Each and every episode is produced, hosted, and edited by us, Meg and Kyle Adams at Home Place Creative. Happy storytelling.